It was one of those evenings in St. Mary Mead when the frost seemed to have settled like sugar on a Christmas pudding. Every hedge and rooftop glistened with a silvery crust, and the air held the sharp, exhilarating chill of an English December night. The entire village had turned its attention to the event of the season, the annual Christmas charity fete at St. Mildred's Hall, where the good ladies of the parish, under Mrs. Bantry's firm but genial guidance, would sell homemade puddings, knitted scarves, and jars of mincemeat for the benefit of the church roof fund. Before we begin tonight's mystery, tell me, where are you listening from this evening? I love knowing where our mystery lovers are joining us from around the world. And don't forget to grab a warm cup of tea. Miss Marple would insist on it, if you haven't already. Make sure you've subscribed and rung the little bell, so you never miss another classic tale of quiet villages, dark secrets, and Miss Marple's unshakable wisdom. Now then, settle in by the fire, because tonight, beneath the glow of Christmas candlelight, a murder will unfold. Miss Marple had come, of course, as she always did, in her neat navy coat and soft pink wool hat. Her expression was one of mild amusement and quiet attentiveness. She moved through the hall like a small, unassuming wren among finches, noticing everything, disturbing nothing. Inside, the great hall was aglow with candlelight and chatter. A choir of children from the local school sang "O Come All Ye Faithful" from the raised platform, their breath puffing into the chill air between verses. Mrs. Bantry was in her element, distributing sherry with a mixture of elegance and command, while her husband, Colonel Bantry, stood near the fireplace, explaining loudly to anyone who would listen that this year's goose population was decidedly inferior due to early frost. It was, by all appearances, the perfect village Christmas evening, until it wasn't. At precisely 8:30, the tall oak doors opened once again, and in swept Mr. Leonard Hargreaves, a man whose reputation in the village was, depending on whom you asked, either enviable or infamous. A wealthy businessman from London. He had purchased Rosemount Cottage the previous spring, and ever since had made a quiet but perceptible impact on the social atmosphere of St. Mary Mead. Some called him generous for donating to the church fund. Others, particularly the ladies at the post office, whispered that he was too generous, especially where Mrs. Lydia Fenton was concerned. Mrs. Fenton, a striking woman in her early 30s, stood near the refreshment table now, nervously fingering her lace handkerchief as she watched Mr. Hargreaves approach. Their eyes met for only a moment, but Miss Marple, sitting serenely in her chair beside the poinsettia display, saw it. The look, brief, secretive, and unmistakably tense, did not escape her. Few things ever did. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," called Mrs. Bantry, clinking her glass, "before we draw the raffle, may I ask everyone to gather by the Christmas tree for a little surprise?" Excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. A grand 7-foot fir tree stood near the dais, decked with handmade ornaments and candles that flickered like tiny stars. Beneath it lay a large crimson box tied with gold ribbon. "A special contribution," Mrs. Bantry declared, "from our most generous benefactor, Mr. Leonard Hargreaves." There was polite applause, and all eyes turned to him. Mr. Hargreaves smiled, the polished, effortless smile of a man accustomed to admiration, and stepped forward to untie the ribbon. What happened next occurred so swiftly that for a moment no one moved. The candles shimmered, the choir children gasped, and then a faint pop, like the sound of a champagne cork, followed by a dull thud. Mr. Hargreaves staggered backward, one hand clutching his chest, eyes wide with confusion. The next instant, he crumpled onto the wooden floorboards. For several seconds, the hall was filled only with the echo of falling glass and the faint hiss of candles. Then came the first scream. Mrs. Bantry's voice cut through the chaos. "Someone call Dr. Haydock! Quickly!" Colonel Bantry dropped to his knees beside the fallen man. But even before the doctor arrived, even before the murmurs of disbelief gave way to frantic movement, Miss Marple had already risen, her pale eyes calm and alert. She took in the scene as though she were merely watching the conclusion of a play she'd already read. When Dr. Haydock arrived, breathless, coat hastily thrown over his evening jacket, it took him less than a minute to shake his head gravely. "Dead," he murmured. "Heart failure, most likely. Poor chap." But Miss Marple's expression did not soften into pity. Her gaze lingered on the crimson box, still half open, and then on the faint trace of smoke that curled upward from one of the candles nearest the tree. She noted, too, that Mrs. Lydia Fenton had turned deathly pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her handbag. "Heart failure?" murmured Mrs. Bantry uncertainly, her own face drawn. "Possibly," said Miss Marple quietly, though she did not sound convinced. "Although, heart failure seldom makes a sound like a cork popping." Her words went mostly unheard amidst the confusion. Yet as the evening dissolved into shocked whispers and the police were summoned from the nearby town, a single thought passed through Miss Marple's mind with serene clarity. This was no accident. It would take time and careful observation, but she already sensed that beneath the glitter of candlelight and carols, there lay something dark and deliberate, a shadow cast by human nature itself. The morning after the tragedy at St. Mildred's Hall dawned pale and cold, the village wrapped in a thin mist that seemed to hush even the birds. Yet if the air outside was quiet, the talk within St. Mary Mead was anything but. By breakfast time, the entire affair had been thoroughly dissected and misinterpreted by nearly every soul from the vicar's wife to the milkman. At the heart of this quiet storm sat the Bluebell Tea Room, a modest establishment run by Miss Hartnell's niece, where the locals gathered for gossip disguised as morning refreshment. The smell of toast and boiled tea filled the air, mingling with the crisp rustle of the Morning Gazette, which declared in heavy black print, "Tragic death at St. Mildred's. Businessman collapses during Christmas fete." Of course, in St. Mary Mead that headline was only the beginning. "Mark my words," said Mrs. Price Ridley, leaning forward over her teacup with a knowing expression. "It wasn't natural causes. I heard from young Tommy Wheeler that when they moved the body there was a smell, something strange like almonds." "Almonds?" gasped Miss Hartnell, her eyes widening. "Oh, surely not." "You mean—" "Exactly what I mean," Mrs. Price Ridley said triumphantly. "Poison. Cyanide, I shouldn't wonder. Terrible business. Of course, I've always said one should never trust newcomers, especially those with money." Across the room, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, her hands folded around her cup of tea, listening without appearing to. She had heard it all before. The leaps of imagination, the confident declarations, the inevitable confusion of speculation and fact. To Miss Marple, gossip was like smoke. It rarely revealed the fire directly, but it always drifted in the direction of its source. "Such a pity," murmured Mrs. Bantry, who had just arrived, still looking pale from the previous night's shock. "Poor Mr. Hargreaves, he seemed in excellent health, though a trifle nervous lately, I thought." "Oh?" Miss Marple said mildly. "Nervous, you say?" Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "Yes. He came to tea last week, spoke about how village life was too quiet for him, and how some people resented outsiders. I took it as a joke, but perhaps—" She trailed off, frowning. "And then there's poor Mrs. Fenton. She was dreadfully upset last night." At this, Mrs. Price Ridley's ears practically twitched. "Mrs. Fenton?" she repeated sharply. "You don't mean that Mrs. Fenton, the one whose husband's away in the colonies?" "Oh, I see." She exchanged a look with Miss Hartnell filled with unspoken insinuations. "Well, I did hear she spent rather a lot of time at Rosemount Cottage. Charity work, she called it." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully, her eyes downcast. "Charity is such a curious word," she murmured as though speaking to herself. "It often conceals more self-interest than kindness." No one paid much attention to her remark, which suited her perfectly. For Miss Marple had been observing not just words but tones, the little hesitations, the eagerness in some voices, the discomfort in others. Already she was building her quiet tapestry of motives and moods, though to the casual observer, she looked like nothing more than a gentle old lady lost in her tea. At that moment, Inspector Craddock entered the tea room, his tall frame dusted with frost and his manner brisk but polite. The chatter softened to a nervous murmur. Craddock was known in the village as a fair man, competent, even good-humored, but the sight of Scotland Yard in a place like St. Mary Mead lent everything an uncomfortable gravity. "Good morning, ladies," he said, removing his hat. "I'm afraid I must ask a few questions regarding last night's unfortunate event." Mrs. Price Ridley immediately straightened. "Oh, Inspector, we're more than happy to assist. Such a dreadful shock. Why, I was just saying to Miss Hartnell that poor Mr. Hargreaves was the picture of health, until he wasn't." Craddock smiled faintly. "Quite. His eyes moved toward Miss Marple, softening slightly. "Miss Marple, I thought I might find you here. You were present at the fete, I believe?" "I was," she said simply. "And I must say, Inspector, it was a most unexpected Christmas surprise." There was a tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth. "So I gather. Dr. Haydock confirms Mr. Hargreaves did not die of natural causes. We're awaiting full results, but it seems he ingested poison. Cyanide, to be precise." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Price Ridley nearly dropped her teacup. "Cyanide," she whispered dramatically. "Just as I said." Miss Marple's eyes flickered, not with surprise, but with quiet confirmation. Then the sound we heard, the pop as I called it, may not have been a coincidence, she said gently. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "A pop?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, her tone light, conversational. "Just before Mr. Hargreaves fell, there was a small noise, like a cork. I suppose it might have come from the Christmas box, though I didn't see him open it completely." Craddock nodded slowly. "Interesting. That box is being examined now. The ribbon had traces of powder, possibly residue from the poison." "How dreadful," murmured Mrs. Bantry. "Who on earth would do such a thing, especially at Christmas?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where frost still clung to the panes. "People seldom need an occasion for unkindness," she said softly. "Only an opportunity." The inspector gave her a look that was half respect, half resignation. "I'll be calling on you later, Miss Marple, if you don't mind. I've a feeling you noticed more than most." "Oh, I doubt that, Inspector," she said with her characteristic modesty. "I'm just an old woman who observes and remembers." But as she watched him leave, her eyes held that delicate gleam, the one that meant she had already begun to see the threads no one else had noticed. Something about that crimson box, and the look between Mr. Hargreaves and Mrs. Fenton, was beginning to form a pattern in her mind. And though the rest of the village would spend the day swapping stories over tea and toast, Miss Marple would spend hers quietly thinking, as she always did, about human nature, the one puzzle that never truly changed. The frost had thickened overnight, turning the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead into delicate lace. As the church bells struck 10, Inspector Craddock arrived once more at Rosemount Cottage, the late Mr. Hargreaves's residence, a fine, ivy-clad house on the edge of the village, all gables and old red brick. The curtains were drawn tight, but the hearth still smelled faintly of last night's fire. Craddock was not alone. In a cozy chair near the fireplace, wrapped in a pale blue shawl and knitting a neat row of something pink and soft, sat Miss Marple. She had, quite naturally, dropped by to deliver condolences to the housekeeper, and quite incidentally, to see what the police were discovering. "You do have a talent for being precisely where things happen, Miss Marple," said Craddock dryly as he stepped inside. She looked up with mild surprise. "Oh, dear me, I hope not. I only came to ensure Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, was managing. Poor soul, she's quite overcome." Mrs. Finch, a plump woman in her 50s with tear-reddened eyes, sniffled. "He was a good man, sir, truly he was. Demanding, perhaps, but always polite. Oh, to think of him lying there." Craddock nodded sympathetically, then turned to Sergeant Wills, who was bent over a writing desk near the window. "Find anything yet?" The sergeant straightened, holding a small envelope between two gloved fingers. "Yes, sir. This was hidden behind the clock. Looks recent." Craddock took it carefully. The envelope was ivory, the handwriting elegant, a woman's hand. He opened it and read aloud. "My dearest Leonard, you must understand that it cannot go on this way. Someone will notice, and I cannot bear the shame. Do not write again, for both our sakes. It was unsigned." Mrs. Finch gasped. "Oh, heavens. That must be from... Well, I couldn't say, of course, but..." Miss Marple looked up serenely. "From Mrs. Lydia Fenton, perhaps?" The inspector glanced at her. "You seem very sure." "Oh, not sure, Inspector," Miss Marple said modestly. "Only, one observes. Mrs. Fenton is the sort of woman who feels things deeply, and when people feel deeply, they tend to write rather than speak. It's so much safer, don't you think?" Craddock hid a smile. "I suppose it depends who's reading the letters." He folded the paper and tucked it into an evidence envelope. "Still, that gives us something. A possible motive, jealousy, scandal, exposure. If Mrs. Fenton feared gossip, she might have wanted to silence him." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Perhaps. But women seldom poison men they have loved, Inspector, unless they have been betrayed. If Mrs. Fenton feared him, now that might be another matter. Craddock frowned. Feared him? What makes you think so? Only that Mr. Hargreaves had the look of a man used to control, she said gently. And fear leaves traces. Little tremors in the hand, a glance too long or too short. I noticed both in Mrs. Fenton last night. Craddock considered this, then gestured toward the sideboard. Speaking of traces, there's something else. The Christmas box, it sat there, open now, the golden ribbon removed. Inside, nestled among tissue paper, was what looked like a bottle of champagne. Or rather, had been one. The neck was broken, the cork gone. Craddock leaned down. The forensics chap says the glass around the cork had a residue of cyanide. We think the poison was applied to the cork itself. When Mr. Hargreaves opened it, the pop, finished Miss Marple softly. So the poison was released as vapor? Exactly. Enough to kill him instantly. Ingenious, really. Whoever planned it knew chemistry. Miss Marple sighed. How very modern, and how very cruel. She rose and walked slowly to the sideboard, her sharp eyes scanning the arrangement. Tell me, Inspector, who packed this box? We're not sure, he said. It was labeled as Mr. Hargreaves's donation to the fete, sent from his house earlier that day by a delivery boy. But the box itself seems to have come from the local shop. And who works there? Mr. and Mrs. Pettigrew and their daughter Alice. Why? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, no reason. Only that young Alice Pettigrew is engaged to Mr. Fenton's nephew, is she not? And Mrs. Pettigrew happens to be a most observant woman. One wonders whether she might have noticed something. Out of place. Craddock chuckled quietly. You really don't leave anyone out, do you, Miss Marple? I never do, she said serenely. Village life teaches one that secrets have long roots when they often tangle. Just then, Sergeant Wills called out, Sir, there's something else. He held up a small silver object found near the hearth. A locket. Delicate and heart-shaped. Inside was a photograph of a man, young, dark-haired with an oddly familiar expression, and opposite, a tiny curl of golden hair tied with thread. Miss Marple leaned forward. How curious, she murmured. That isn't Mr. Hargreaves. No, Craddock said slowly. But I've seen him before. Wait, that's Henry Fenton, Mrs. Fenton's husband. He's in Malaya, isn't he? It is, said Miss Marple softly. Or was. There was silence. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause. Craddock turned the locket over, and there, faint but unmistakable, was an engraving. To L, with my heart, always. H. Craddock looked up sharply. H for Henry? Or H for Hargreaves, Miss Marple said gently. 2 men, 1 woman, and a locket that binds them both. A dangerous triangle, Inspector. Dangerous and very human. She looked out the frosted window where the faint tracks of carriage wheels marked the snow. I should imagine the village will be buzzing before lunch. Craddock sighed. Oh, it's buzzing already. And something tells me you're 3 steps ahead of us. Not at all, she said, returning to her knitting, merely and watching how people behave when they think no one is. And as the inspector departed, leaving her in the quiet warmth of the cottage, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of smiles. She had seen that kind of jealousy before, the sort that festers quietly beneath respectability, that turns affection to spite when threatened with exposure. But something about this case felt different. The scent of almonds, the perfectly timed donation, the locket. No, this was not the work of passion. This was planning. Cold, precise, and patient, and somewhere in St. Mary Mead, amid the Christmas wreaths and carols, someone was still smiling, because they thought they'd gotten away with murder. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had transformed from a sleepy village of Christmas cheer into a hive of whispered suspicions. Every doorstep conversation began the same way and with sympathy, and ended with a quiet, almost thrilling murmur. But between you and me, 3 names now fluttered through those whispers like tattered ribbons caught in the winter wind. Mrs. Lydia Fenton, the striking young wife of an absent husband. Mrs. Finch, the loyal housekeeper who knew too much about the master's affairs. And Alice Pettigrew, the sweet-faced girl at the shop who had handled the mysterious Christmas box. And though Inspector Craddock worked diligently to follow the evidence, it was Miss Marple in her gentle, unassuming way who truly began to untangle the threads. That morning, she paid her first call on Mrs. Lydia Fenton, whose cottage stood near the old mill stream, a picture of charm with white painted shutters and a wreath of holly on the door. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of lilacs and faint perfume. Mrs. Fenton was pale but composed, dressed in mourning black, though the tragedy had barely reached its second day. She rose as Miss Marple entered, forcing a smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're very kind to call. I don't quite know how to... It's all been so dreadful." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple said soothingly, accepting the offered chair. "Such things are never easy to bear. But you mustn't let your nerves get the better of you. A cup of tea can do wonders." Mrs. Fenton poured with trembling hands. "I hardly slept last night. The police were here asking questions. About Leonard. They found that letter, didn't they?" Miss Marple's knitting bag rested quietly in her lap. "I believe they did," Mrs. Fenton's voice faltered. "I suppose you think I hated him, that I wanted him dead. But you don't understand. He was kind at first when I was lonely. My husband's been away for nearly 2 years now. But then Leonard began to expect things. He could be rather cruel when he didn't get his way." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Cruelty often wears the mask of charm, my dear. It is a pattern one sees far too often." The young woman stared down at her teacup. "I told him it was over. I even wrote to him. You know that, don't you? But I never imagined..." She broke off suddenly, glancing toward the window. "They all think I did it, don't they?" "People always think," said Miss Marple gently. "But what matters is truth. Tell me, did you see Mr. Hargreaves before the fete?" Mrs. Fenton hesitated. "He sent a note that morning. Said he wanted to speak privately after the raffle. But I never did. I couldn't face him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I see. Well, my dear, if I may give you a small piece of advice, I do keep calm and do not destroy that note if you still have it." Mrs. Fenton looked startled. "Destroy it? Of course not. Why should I?" But Miss Marple's mild smile already told her she'd said too much. From Mrs. Fenton's perfumed cottage, Miss Marple's next stop was quite a different setting. The back kitchen of Rosemount Cottage, where Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, was vigorously scrubbing a copper pot. Her sleeves rolled high. "I tell you, Miss Marple, I've worked for gentlemen all my life, but never one so particular as Mr. Hargreaves," the woman said, shaking her head. "Every letter locked away, every drawer in order. And yet last week I found the study door ajar, and someone had been in there. Papers moved. I told him so, but he said it must have been me." "Me?" Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking softly. "And was it?" Mrs. Finch flushed. "No, ma'am. I may be forgetful, but not blind. Someone else was snooping. And who might that be, do you think?" "Well," Mrs. Finch lowered her voice, "I did see young Alice Pettigrew leaving the garden path one evening just before dark. Said she'd been delivering parcels for the shop. But Mr. Hargreaves never bought much from them, you know. Too proud." "I thought it odd." "How interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And did he receive any visitors that same week?" "Only Mrs. Fenton," Mrs. Finch said grimly. "And not for the first time." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. You've been most helpful. Oh, one last thing. The Christmas box, the one he sent to the fete. Did you see it before it was taken away?" Mrs. Finch frowned, thinking. "Yes, I packed it myself. Leastways, I thought I did. But come to think of it, there were 2 boxes in the hall that morning. One for the fete and one meant for the vicarage. I remember because the ribbons were different. One red, one gold. But when the delivery boy came, he only took one. I couldn't swear which." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. 2 boxes? How very curious. Her final visit of the day was to Pettigrew's general store, where Alice Pettigrew stood behind the counter, twisting her apron in nervous fingers. "Good morning, Alice," said Miss Marple kindly. "You must be very tired after all the excitement." "Oh, Miss Marple, it's awful," Alice said, her blue eyes filling. "They say I might have touched that poisoned box. But I didn't, I swear. I just tied the ribbon Mr. Hargreaves brought in. He said it was for the fete and wanted it to look nice." "He brought the box himself?" "Yes, ma'am. He came just before closing, said he'd run out of wrapping. I helped him tie it, but I never looked inside. It rattled, though, like glass." "Did he seem nervous?" Alice bit her lip. "More angry. He muttered something about being made a fool of. I didn't understand."
"Oh, Miss Marple, do you think he knew someone was going to hurt him?"
Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes people know they're walking toward trouble. My dear, but pride makes them go all the same. That evening, as the frost returned and carolers sang faintly in the distance, Miss Marple sat by her fire with a cup of cocoa and her knitting half finished. 3 women. 3 very different kinds of fear. Mrs. Fenton feared exposure. Mrs. Finch feared dismissal, or worse, suspicion. And young Alice Pettigrew feared guilt by association. But it was Mrs. Finch's remark about 2 boxes that occupied Miss Marple's thoughts long into the night. 2 boxes. One meant for the fete, one for the vicarage. If they had been swapped, deliberately or by mistake, then perhaps the intended victim was not Mr. Hargreaves at all. She set down her cup and stared into the fire, the flicker of light glinting in her eyes. Yes, she murmured softly. If that is true, then someone else was meant to die under the Christmas candlelight. The next morning dawned with a sky so pale it was almost translucent. The kind of still winter morning when even the sparrows seemed hesitant to disturb the peace. But in St. Mary Mead, peace had already been disturbed beyond repair. The whispers had matured into theories, and theories into quiet accusations. It was just after 10 when Miss Marple, looking neat and composed in her dove-gray coat, appeared at the vicarage with a small tin of seed cake. To the casual observer, she might have seemed a kindly old lady delivering comfort to the Reverend Clement and his wife after such dreadful goings-on. But those who knew Miss Marple better might have noticed the alert curiosity behind her soft blue eyes. The vicar, a gentleman with thinning hair and mild manners, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, my dear lady, what a pleasure, though I fear you'll find us in some disarray. Ever since poor Mr. Hargreaves' passing, my telephone has rung without mercy. The press, of all things. One reporter even asked whether the Lord was among the suspects." Miss Marple smiled politely, setting down the seed cake. "People do say the most peculiar things when they're frightened, Mr. Clement. Fear is a dreadful breeder of nonsense." Mrs. Clement entered, a brisk, good-hearted woman with a fondness for order. "We've just made some tea, Miss Marple. Do stay. You'll want warming up. It's frightfully cold this morning." Miss Marple accepted with a grateful nod. "Thank you, dear. I did want a quiet word, actually. It's about the parcels sent to the fete." The vicar blinked. "The parcels? Oh yes, for the raffle. Quite a few generous contributions this year." "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, stirring her tea. "And I believe one of them was meant for you personally. A Christmas box, as I understand it." The vicar and his wife exchanged surprised glances. "Well, yes," said Mrs. Clement after a pause. "Mr. Hargreaves sent a parcel addressed to my husband. It arrived that same morning. I placed it by the mantel to open later, but, well, after the news I quite forgot." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted delicately. "You still have it, then?" "Oh, indeed," said Mrs. Clement, rising at once. "I'll fetch it." Moments later, she returned with a square box wrapped in red paper tied with a gold ribbon. Miss Marple regarded it calmly. It was nearly identical to the description of the box from the fete. "Would you mind terribly," she asked sweetly, "if we opened it together?" The vicar, looking mildly alarmed, agreed. Carefully he untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, instead of champagne or trinkets, lay a neat stack of envelopes, each marked Charity Roof Fund, Private Accounts. Mrs. Clement frowned. "Good gracious. These are the parish fund ledgers. But how—" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "How indeed? I believe Mr. Hargreaves intended to deliver these to you in confidence. You see, he had recently made a generous donation to the church, had he not?" The vicar nodded. "A substantial one, yes. £200, to help with the roof repairs. But the funds never appeared in the bank. We thought it must have been a mistake." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Then this box explains quite a lot. Someone must have diverted the donation," Mrs. Clement gasped. "You mean stolen it? Perhaps Mr. Hargreaves discovered it missing and meant to return the ledgers to you before confronting the culprit. Only he never had the chance." The vicar sank into his chair, visibly troubled. "Good heavens. You think that's why he was killed?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "It would explain much, wouldn't it? But more importantly, it suggests that the wrong box was sent to the fete." "The wrong box?" "Yes. There were 2, you see. One containing the ledgers and one containing the poisoned bottle. The gold ribbon on this one should have gone to the fete, but it did not. Someone switched them, deliberately or by mistake. The question is which. The room fell into uneasy silence. Mrs. Clement was the first to speak. If the poison was meant for us, then you might both be dead, Miss Marple finished gently. A chilling thought, is it not? The vicar pressed a trembling hand to his brow. But who would wish us harm? Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the window, where the frost glimmered faintly on the glass. Sometimes, dear Reverend, harm comes not from hatred, but from fear. Fear of discovery, fear of disgrace. Someone in this village has both. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned home, her mind quietly weaving the new thread into her mental tapestry. She sat by the fire, knitting needles clicking softly as the clock chimed noon. A stolen church donation. A man who discovered the truth. A switched parcel. And a death that may not have been intended. It was a delicate pattern, but she could already sense the shape of it. Her reverie was broken by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, his expression grim but curious. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "I've just come from the vicarage. They tell me you've discovered quite a revelation." "Oh, I wouldn't say discovered," she said modestly. "Merely noticed," he sighed. "That's precisely what worries me. Every time you notice something, I end up rewriting half my report." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then you'll be pleased to know there's one more thing you ought to consider. The ribbon." "The ribbon?" "Yes. Mrs. Finch said there were 2 boxes, one tied with red, one with gold. Yet this morning the vicar's box, the one with the ledgers, was tied with gold, which means the one that went to the fete should have been red. But the poisoned box also had a gold ribbon." Craddock frowned deeply. "Then someone deliberately changed them." "Exactly," said Miss Marple softly. "And I should think whoever handled those boxes last must have known the difference." Craddock's expression hardened. "Alice Pettigrew." Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. "Perhaps," she said at last. "But if she did, it may not have been of her own accord. You see, Inspector, the truly clever villain never dirties their own hands." She rose and moved toward the window, gazing out at the falling snow. "Somewhere among our good villagers there's someone whose generosity was only ever a disguise. Someone who would rather let an innocent die than face exposure." "The switch was no accident," Craddock nodded slowly. "You think the poison was meant for the vicar?" "Oh no," Miss Marple said softly, turning back to him. "I think it was meant for someone far closer to the truth, and Mr. Hargreaves simply opened the wrong gift." The inspector stared at her, brow furrowed. "Then who was the intended target?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "Why, my dear Inspector, that's what we must find out before there's another Christmas death." The day after Miss Marple's discovery at the vicarage brought attention to St. Mary Mead that no amount of Christmas cheer could soften. Even the carolers seemed hesitant that evening, their songs faltering as though the village itself held its breath. By mid-afternoon, the frost had thickened into a hard glitter across the cobbles. Inspector Craddock, looking distinctly wearier than usual, was holding what he grimly called a parade of truths inside the Bantry's drawing room, one of the few houses large enough to accommodate both suspects and discretion. Mrs. Bantry, who had offered the space for the sake of justice and propriety, was now regretting her generosity. "Really, Henry," she whispered to her husband as they stood by the window, "I wish they'd have these dreadful police meetings somewhere less domestic. I feel as though the murderer might be sitting on my sofa." "Probably is," muttered Colonel Bantry under his breath. The first to arrive was Mrs. Fenton, her beauty dimmed by sleeplessness. She wore dark blue this time instead of black, as though halfway between defiance and mourning. Next came Mrs. Finch, fidgeting with her gloves and insisting she hadn't stolen a farthing. "Thank you very much." Finally, Alice Pettigrew entered quietly, escorted by her mother, the elder Mrs. Pettigrew, whose disapproving look could have curdled milk. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner armchair, knitting needles at rest for once, her gaze mild but unwavering. She looked less like a detective and more like a patient schoolmistress waiting for her pupils to settle before a particularly important lesson. Inspector Craddock began briskly. "Let me state plainly, Mr. Hargreaves was poisoned. The method was clever, the means deliberate. We now know that 2 boxes existed that morning, one with ledgers for the vicarage, one containing the fatal bottle. The question is who switched them and why." There was silence, the heavy breathing kind of silence that carries the weight of too many unspoken fears. Mrs. Finch spoke first, her voice trembling. It wasn't me, sir. I packed the boxes myself. I'd never harm anyone, and I've no reason to. Yet you were in the house all morning, said Craddock. You had access to both boxes. That's true, sir, but Mr. Hargreaves told me plain which was which. The one for the fete had a gold ribbon and the vicar's had red. Miss Marple raised her head slightly. Are you quite sure, Mrs. Finch? As sure as I'm standing here, she said earnestly. Interesting, murmured Miss Marple. Because the vicar's box was tied with gold when I saw it, not red. Mrs. Finch's mouth fell open. Then someone must have switched them after you packed them, Miss Marple finished gently. Precisely, Inspector Craddock folded his arms. That brings us to you, Miss Pettigrew. You wrapped the boxes, didn't you? Alice looked as though she might burst into tears. Yes, sir, but I didn't switch anything. Mr. Hargreaves brought the box to the shop. He said it was for the fete. I tied the ribbon he handed me. That's all. Her mother interjected sharply. Alice wouldn't hurt a fly. It's shameful dragging her into this. Quite, said Miss Marple, her tone calm but firm. And yet, Mrs. Pettigrew, I think you might be able to tell us something important. You were seen, you know, visiting Rosemount Cottage 2 days before the fete. Mrs. Pettigrew stiffened. I brought his account books, that's all. He owed the shop for supplies. Yes, Miss Marple said, her voice softening. But perhaps he also owed you something more. Personal. A flush crept up the woman's neck. I don't know what you mean. Oh, but I think you do, Miss Marple said gently. I believe Mr. Hargreaves discovered that someone had been taking advantage of the vicar's trust, diverting small amounts from the church fund, perhaps, through the shop accounts. He meant to expose it, and that frightened you. Mrs. Pettigrew's face went ashen. I never stole, Miss Marple interrupted kindly but firmly. No, not you directly, but your husband, perhaps, or someone who used your shop to move the money. You see, the accounts in the vicar's box included a note, in Mr. Hargreaves's handwriting, about unexplained discrepancies in Pettigrew and Son accounts. That's why the ledgers were going to the vicar. He meant to reveal it that night. There was a ripple through the room. Colonel Bantry coughed. Mrs. Bantry whispered, Good heavens. Craddock turned to Mrs. Pettigrew. Is that true? Her lips trembled. It was my husband, she said at last in a low voice. He borrowed a little now and then just to keep the shop afloat. Mr. Hargreaves found out. He threatened to tell everyone, to ruin us. I begged him not to. Did you switch the boxes? Craddock asked quietly. She shook her head frantically. No, I only begged him for mercy. I never touched the parcels. I swear it on my soul. Miss Marple watched her with steady eyes. And did your daughter know? Alice looked horrified. No, Miss Marple. I didn't know a thing until today. Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod. Then I believe you, my dear. You tied the ribbons just as you were told. Inspector Craddock rubbed his chin. But someone still switched them. Someone who knew what was in both. Someone who stood to lose everything if the vicar had opened his parcel. The room fell silent again. Mrs. Fenton's voice, quiet but edged with strain, broke it. Then it wasn't me you should be questioning. I thought Leonard wanted to keep our affair secret, but perhaps he was blackmailing others too. Miss Marple turned her calm gaze upon her. I rather think he was, my dear. Mr. Hargreaves enjoyed holding power. He dangled secrets as other men dangle charms. But tell me, did he ever threaten you with exposure? Mrs. Fenton hesitated. Yes, she whispered. He said if I didn't see him at the fete, he'd send letters to my husband in Malaya. That's why I stayed away. I was terrified. But I didn't poison him, Miss Marple. I swear it. Miss Marple's eyes softened. I know you didn't. Poison requires planning, not panic. And I think I know who did both. All eyes turned to her, but she simply resumed her knitting. When one lives in a village as long as I have, she said quietly, one learns to see how guilt settles on people, like frost on the morning window. It leaves traces, however hard they try to wipe them away. She looked up at Inspector Craddock. It's time, I think, that we look again at who delivered the parcels to the fete, and who might have changed their destination along the way. Craddock frowned. The delivery boy? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Or perhaps the man who sent him. Her needles clicked once, twice. The most dangerous villains, Inspector, are not the thieves or the adulterers. They're the ones who think they're doing something right. And as the firelight flickered against the frosted windows of the Bantry's drawing room, Miss Marple knew the time for quiet observation was nearly over. The truth, cold, intricate, and cruelly human, was ready to reveal itself. It was a week before Christmas, and the frost that had settled over St. Mary Mead seemed heavier than ever, as though the earth itself had drawn a shroud. The bells from St. Mildred's tolled softly in the distance, their sound carrying through the still biting air. Yet beneath that silence, the village trembled. There had been whispers before, about affairs, stolen funds, and switched parcels. But now there was something more chilling. Fear. It began with a scream. Just past 5 in the evening, when the sky turned an indigo blue and the shop lamps began to glow, young Alice Pettigrew came running down the lane from Rosemount Cottage, her face white as the snow beneath her boots. She burst into the post office, breathless and crying. "Mr. Craddock," she gasped.
"It's Mrs. Finch. She's dead."
The inspector arrived within minutes, coat flapping, his breath visible in the cold. Miss Marple, having been in the parlor of Mrs. Bantry's house discussing wreaths and puddings, was informed almost instantly, and within half an hour she too stood at the door of the late Mr. Hargreaves's residence. The scene was eerily familiar. Mrs. Finch lay collapsed beside the hearth, her hands clenched, her lips faintly blue. A teacup lay shattered beside her. Dr. Haydock bent over the body, grim-faced. "Poison again," he said. "Cyanide by the smell. Instantaneous." Craddock swore under his breath. "Another cup of kindness, eh? Good Lord." Miss Marple, her shawl drawn close, surveyed the room with quiet intensity. "Poor Mrs. Finch," she murmured. "So many tears, so much loyalty. And yet perhaps she knew too much." Craddock frowned. "You think she was silenced?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that she might have been the first to realize who switched those boxes, and that realization, dear Inspector, can be quite fatal." He looked down at the body again. "She was the only one in the house that day." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "Which means she may have seen something, or someone, she wasn't meant to." Later that evening, the two of them sat in Miss Marple's cottage, the fire crackling, the curtains drawn tight. A tray of tea lay untouched on the table. Craddock leaned forward, his face lined with fatigue. "I'll admit it, Miss Marple, I'm lost. Every time I think I've got the culprit cornered, another twist comes along. First Hargreaves, now Mrs. Finch, and both poisoned in precisely the same way." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Oh, not quite the same, Inspector. Mr. Hargreaves's poison came from vapor, remember? This one from a cup. That distinction, small as it seems, is rather important." "How so?" "Because," she said gently, "it tells us that whoever killed Mrs. Finch didn't have access to the same elaborate preparation as before. They improvised. They were desperate." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Desperate to keep something buried." "Precisely," she set her knitting aside. "Tell me, Inspector, have you found out who actually sent the delivery boy to the fete that night?" He sighed. "We did. It was Mr. Pettigrew himself. Said Hargreaves asked him as a favor since the regular errand boy was ill." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you happen to notice that Mr. Pettigrew hasn't been seen much since?" Craddock blinked. "Come to think of it, no. His wife claims he's taken ill." Said Miss Marple softly. "A very convenient illness, one that keeps a man out of sight while the truth unravels." She stood then, crossing to her small writing desk and opening a drawer. From it, she drew a small envelope, one that had been delivered earlier that day. "This came for me this morning," she said. No return address, but quite obviously local. Craddock took it, unfolded the note, and read aloud. "You should stop prying into matters that don't concern you. Leave the past where it lies, or you'll regret it." He looked up sharply. "A threat?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "I should say an admission, wouldn't you?" Craddock frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said, "that our murderer is frightened, and frightened people make mistakes." The next morning, those very mistakes began to surface. At dawn, Constable March arrived at Pettigrew's general store to deliver a notice and found Mrs. Pettigrew packing a suitcase. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. When questioned, she broke down entirely. "It was my husband," she sobbed. "He did it. He poisoned Hargreaves. He thought Hargreaves would ruin us, that he'd tell everyone about the missing money. He meant to kill the vicar instead, to make it look like an accident. But the parcels were switched by mistake. Oh God, he never meant to kill the wrong man. Where is he now?" the constable demanded. "In the old mill," she cried. "He said he couldn't face the shame. He's gone to end it." By the time Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple arrived at the mill, the snow had begun to fall in thick, ghostly sheets. The water wheel stood frozen, silent as death itself. Inside, in the dim, cold light that seeped through broken windows, they found Mr. Pettigrew, slumped against a beam, a bottle clutched loosely in his hand. The same bitter almond scent lingered faintly in the air. Dr. Haydock confirmed what they already knew. "He took his own life," the doctor said quietly. "Cyanide again, likely the same source." Craddock stared at the body for a long moment. "So that's it then. Pettigrew switched the boxes, meaning to kill the vicar, but accidentally sent the poison to the fate instead. Hargreaves died in his place, and when Mrs. Finch figured it out, he silenced her." Miss Marple's eyes were distant. "Yes, but not quite how you imagine." Craddock turned sharply. "You don't think he—" "No," she said softly. "Mr. Pettigrew didn't kill Mrs. Finch. He was already gone to ground when she died. The second poison was someone else's doing." He stared at her. "Then who?" Miss Marple's gaze dropped to the ground, to the small glinting fragment of glass near the beam. A teacup shard faintly dusted with powder. She picked it up delicately. "The one person," she said quietly, "who feared Mrs. Finch's tongue even more than the truth itself, someone whose reputation depended upon it." She looked up at him. "Mrs. Lydia Fenton." Craddock's mouth fell open. "Mrs. Fenton, but why?" "Because Mrs. Finch knew too much," Miss Marple said calmly. "She saw Mrs. Fenton visit Rosemount the day before the fete. She saw her slip something into Mr. Hargreaves's study. A letter, perhaps, or something more tangible. She also overheard a quarrel, and after Mr. Hargreaves's death, she realized what it meant. Mrs. Fenton was terrified of exposure. When Mrs. Finch threatened to speak her mind, the poor woman's fate was sealed." Craddock exhaled slowly. "Good Lord, so it was two killers, not one." Miss Marple nodded. "One planned a death and one tried to bury a secret, both victims of pride, fear, and the sad human talent for making sin look like survival." She looked toward the window, where the first faint light of morning touched the snow outside. "It will be Christmas soon," she said softly. "And yet, there'll be little peace in St. Mary Mead this year." The afternoon following Mr. Pettigrew's death was strangely bright for midwinter, sunlight spilling over the frost-covered hedges like gold upon glass. Yet within that brightness, St. Mary Mead remained dim, as though the village itself recoiled from its reflection. Rumor had raced faster than the post, as it always did. People spoke in half-whispers about the two killers, the desperate shopkeeper who'd tried to save his reputation and the beautiful widow whose fear had turned fatal. But Inspector Craddock, despite all evidence and Miss Marple's calm certainty, knew that a confession was still required, and that Lydia Fenton was not the sort to break under the force of mere questioning. It would take something subtler. Something distinctly Miss Marple. That evening, as dusk fell and the church bells tolled 6, Miss Marple arranged a small, almost accidental tea invitation. The setting was her own parlor, a cozy lamplit room lined with rose-patterned wallpaper and faintly scented of lavender polish and old books. A modest fire crackled in the grate, and 2 teacups gleamed upon the lace-covered table. The invitation to Mrs. Fenton had been worded kindly, even motherly. "My dear, I thought perhaps you could use some quiet company this evening. I've baked a little sponge cake, and I think a chat might do us both good. Yours most sincerely, Jane Marple." Mrs. Fenton had come. Whether out of courtesy, guilt, or curiosity, Miss Marple couldn't say. though she rather suspected it was all three. The young woman looked elegant as ever, though paler now, her beauty sharpened by fatigue. She carried herself with the brittle composure of someone walking through a dream that might shatter at any step. "How kind of you to invite me, Miss Marple," she said softly as she entered. "Everyone else seems to look at me as if I were already convicted." "Oh, nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly, pouring tea. "People gossip because it's easier than thinking." "Sugar?" Mrs. Fenton nodded faintly. "Please." Miss Marple stirred the tea carefully, then handed her the cup. "You mustn't take their talk too seriously. It's only human nature, and human nature, as I often say, is a most untidy business." Mrs. Fenton gave a small, joyless smile. "You always seem to understand people, Miss Marple. I sometimes wish I could see through them the way you do." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled mildly over the rim of her teacup. "Oh, I shouldn't recommend it, my dear. One learns very little that is pleasant. Still, understanding is often the only kindness left to us." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Then Miss Marple said almost idly, "I was thinking, about poor Mrs. Finch. Such a good woman, though perhaps too honest for her own comfort." Mrs. Fenton froze slightly, her teacup hovering just above its saucer. "Yes," she said after a pause. "Dreadful business. I can't think who would wish her harm." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I thought perhaps you might. You see, she told someone, Dr. Haydock, I believe, that she'd overheard a quarrel at Rosemount the day before Mr. Hargreaves's death. Between you and him." A faint tremor passed through Mrs. Fenton's hand. "That's absurd. I never—" "Oh, I don't doubt it was accidental," Miss Marple interrupted smoothly. "You only went to collect a letter, perhaps, or to return something he'd given you. I expect the quarrel came quite naturally, emotions and so on. But you see, my dear, Mrs. Finch remembered. And when people remember inconvenient things, others sometimes grow anxious." Mrs. Fenton set her cup down carefully. "You're implying—" "Not implying, dear," Miss Marple said, her tone soft as snow. "Simply observing. And one must admit Mrs. Finch's death was a very unfortunate coincidence, wasn't it? Poisoned tea so soon after poor Mr. Hargreaves's accident." The young woman's breath quickened. "You think I gave her that tea?" Miss Marple's expression was serene. "Oh, no, I wouldn't presume. But you were at Rosemount that afternoon, were you not? To fetch something you'd left behind?" Mrs. Fenton hesitated too long before answering. I might have stopped by." "Just briefly." "Of course," said Miss Marple, nodding as if that settled it. "Perfectly understandable. Though I do wonder how Mrs. Finch managed to drink from the cup you brought, since, according to Dr. Haydock, it contained a trace of your perfume." For the briefest instant, Mrs. Fenton's eyes widened, then shuddered again. "You're mistaken." Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "Oh, I dare say I am. Still, scent is such a curious thing. It lingers, like guilt, I suppose." Silence fell. Only the fire crackled now, soft and persistent. Then Mrs. Fenton whispered, "I didn't mean to hurt her. She frightened me. She said she'd go to the police and that she knew I'd been to Leonard's house. She wouldn't stop. I only wanted to quiet her just for a while. I thought if she was ill, she'd keep silent. I didn't think—" Her voice broke. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely reached over, laid a gentle hand upon the young woman's trembling fingers, and said softly, "My dear child, people seldom mean to kill. They only mean to protect themselves, and from shame, from loss, from the reflection they can't bear to see in others' eyes. But death once invited never leaves politely." Tears streamed down Mrs. Fenton's cheeks. "I was so afraid. I didn't know what else to do." "I know," Miss Marple murmured. "Fear makes fools of us all." She rose quietly, smoothing her skirt. "Inspector Craddock will be here presently. I asked him to come for tea as well." Mrs. Fenton looked up, stricken. You knew?" Miss Marple's smile was tender, almost maternal. "My dear, I suspected. One doesn't invite guests without preparing properly." As if on cue, the knock came at the door. Craddock stepped in, hat in hand, eyes somber. He looked at Miss Marple, then at Mrs. Fenton, who sat motionless, her confession still echoing in the air. "She's ready, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly. "Do be gentle." An hour later, after the police had gone and the lamps were dim, Miss Marple sat again by her fire, her knitting in her lap. Outside, the church bells tolled for evening prayer, their notes soft and mournful. She sighed, gazing into the flames. "Poor child," she whispered. "So very young to learn that the worst prisons are built from one's own conscience." Then she resumed her knitting. Small, careful stitches, as steady as the rhythm of time itself. 2 evenings after Mrs. Fenton's quiet confession, the Bantrys' drawing room once again became the reluctant stage for revelation. Outside, snow drifted past the windows in a slow, solemn dance, muffling the village and cloaking it in deceptive peace. Within, the fire burned low, casting long shadows that flickered across faces both anxious and grim. Inspector Craddock stood by the hearth, his notes clutched in one hand. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry sat together on the sofa, the latter eager and wide-eyed as though awaiting the last act of a particularly good play. Dr. Haydock occupied an armchair, arms folded, expression skeptical but intrigued, and in her customary seat by the window, pale shawl wrapped neatly about her shoulders, eyes calm and bright, sat Miss Marple, the quiet architect of the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Craddock began, "I've asked you here because, as of this evening, both deaths, Mr. Hargreaves and Mrs. Finch, have been accounted for. But, as always, Miss Marple has explained it rather better than I could. So if you please—" He gestured toward her. Miss Marple smiled modestly. "Oh, dear me, I hardly know where to begin. Perhaps at the beginning, since people so often start there and forget to look back once they've gone too far." She folded her hands in her lap and looked around the room. When poor Mr. Hargreaves fell dead at St. Mildred's fete, everyone quite naturally assumed he was the intended victim. It seemed obvious. He had enemies. He was feared, perhaps even hated. But, as I have often found, the obvious is seldom the true. From the first, there were small things that didn't quite fit. The pop of the cork, too deliberate. The almond smell, faint, not overwhelming. And the Christmas box in which had been packed with such care, yet sent by mistake. These details, seemingly trifling, suggested design rather than chance. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "So the poison wasn't meant for him at all?" "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "The intended recipient was the Reverend Clement. He had begun to question certain irregularities in the church fund accounts. Mr. Hargreaves, having discovered them first, had collected the ledgers, intending to expose the guilty party that evening. He prepared 2 boxes, one for the fete, one for the vicarage. Unfortunately, someone else learned of his plan, Mr. Pettigrew, the shopkeeper. He had been misusing the church funds to keep his business afloat. When he realized that Hargreaves meant to reveal the truth, he decided to silence him, or rather to silence the man who would expose him, which he assumed would be the vicar. He prepared a clever trap, a poisoned bottle disguised as a festive donation. He switched the ribbons, ensuring the vicar's parcel would carry the fatal gold bow. But fate, as it so often does, intervened. The boxes were confused again at the shop, by his own daughter. No less, and the poisoned one went to the fete. Mr. Hargreaves, in presenting his own gift, unwittingly opened his own death. Colonel Bantry gave a low whistle. Ingenious devil. Though not much good it did him in the end. Miss Marple nodded gravely. Indeed, guilt rarely sleeps. When Mrs. Pettigrew saw what had happened, she broke beneath the strain. She tried to protect her husband, but Mrs. Finch, observant, loyal, and far too honest, had already begun to suspect the truth. She alone remembered the 2 boxes, the ribbons, and the strange visit from Mrs. Fenton. And that, she added softly, proved her undoing. Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Because Mrs. Fenton killed her?" "Yes." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Mrs. Fenton was living in her own web of fear. Her affair with Mr. Hargreaves had become something poisonous long before the cyanide appeared. He threatened to send letters to her husband to disgrace her. She visited him the day before his death, and Mrs. Finch overheard their quarrel. After the fete, when gossip began to stir, Mrs. Finch told a few friends she knew more than she should. Mrs. Fenton panicked. She went to Rosemount under the pretense of retrieving a forgotten scarf. She brought a small vial of poison, perhaps leftover from the medicine cabinet her husband kept, and prepared tea for Mrs. Finch, meaning only to frighten her into silence. But fear, you see, makes the hand shake, and once the cup was poured, the room was silent except for the crackle of the fire. Miss Marple continued softly. The next day, Mrs. Fenton realized what she had done. When I invited her to tea, I only asked questions I already knew the answers to. All I needed was to see her eyes when I mentioned Mrs. Finch's perfume lingering on the cup. Guilt always knows its own scent. Dr. Haydock shook his head, half in admiration. You've done it again, Miss Marple. Though I must say it all sounds too tragic for such a pretty little village. Oh, I've always said villages are much like people, she replied gently, charming on the outside, but full of little secrets and sins if you look too closely. We're not so different from cities, only quieter about it. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. So to summarize, Pettigrew planned a murder and caused one by accident. His wife's guilt drove him to suicide. Mrs. Fenton killed in fear of exposure. 2 crimes tied by greed and shame, both sparked by the same man's manipulation. Remarkable symmetry, Miss Marple. Human nature is always symmetrical, Inspector, she said mildly. Its faults balance rather neatly. Mrs. Bantry sighed. And to think it all began with a Christmas fete. I shall never look at mince pies the same way again. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Nor should you, my dear. The world often hides its darkest tragedies beneath its prettiest celebrations. Colonel Bantry grunted. Still, we owe you our thanks, Miss Marple. Heaven knows where we'd be without your infernal knitting and that blasted memory of yours. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Oh, I dare say you'd have muddled through somehow. But I do find that understanding people, truly understanding them, is rather like untangling yarn. Pull the wrong thread and you only make the knot tighter. But if you're patient... She lifted her knitting bag and smiled. It all comes undone quite nicely. Outside, the bells of St. Mildred's rang once more, clear and solemn in the cold air. Within, the Bantry's fire glowed warm and golden, chasing the last of the day's shadows away. And Miss Marple, ever serene, took one final sip of her tea before saying softly, It's strange, isn't it, how death so often chooses the season of peace. But then perhaps Christmas reminds people too much of what they've lost, and what they fear to lose. Her voice trailed off into the hush of the room. Christmas morning dawned with the soft hush that only snow can bring. St. Mary Mead lay blanketed in white, the rooftops powdered like sugar, the lanes lined with frost-tipped hedges that sparkled under the pale gold of the rising sun. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, and from St. Mildred's came the gentle peal of bells, slow and solemn, yet somehow comforting, as if calling the village back to itself after so much turmoil. The air smelled faintly of pine and distant baking, mince pies, puddings, and the first roasted geese of the day. If one walked down the high street, one might have thought nothing dreadful had ever disturbed this peaceful corner of England. The curtains were drawn back in tidy cottages, children played with wooden toys in the snow, and the milkman whistled as though murder were merely a dream that had melted away with the frost. And yet, beneath that illusion of normality, St. Mary Mead carried a quiet heaviness, a reminder that evil had walked its cobblestones, dressed as it so often was in the clothes of respectability. Miss Marple sat by her window, as she did every Christmas morning, her knitting basket at her feet and a small pot of tea steaming gently beside her. The world outside looked serene, untouched, but she knew better. She had seen too much for too many years to mistake silence for peace. Her little parlor was warm, fragrant with pine needles from a modest Christmas tree that Mrs. Bantry had insisted she accept. A few cards stood upon the mantel, one from the Clements, another from Dr. Haydock, and most touching of all, one from Inspector Craddock himself. She smiled as she reread his brief note, written in his neat, deliberate hand. Dear Miss Marple, another year, another case solved by your incomparable intuition. Scotland Yard owes you, as always, a debt it can never repay. Wishing you a peaceful Christmas, though I rather suspect you prefer things lively. Yours sincerely, Dermot Craddock. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Peaceful indeed, she murmured. That would be nice for a change. Her eyes wandered to the snow-laden garden beyond the window. A robin hopped upon the fence, bright as a drop of blood against the white. For a fleeting moment she thought of Lydia Fenton, young, frightened, foolish Lydia, sitting now in a cell in Much Benham, awaiting trial. Miss Marple had visited her the previous afternoon. The girl had been calm, almost relieved. It's strange, she had said quietly, how one can breathe again once the truth is out, even if the air smells of prison walls. Miss Marple had squeezed her hand gently. My dear, there's more freedom in confession than in any lie. The world will forgive you sooner than you'll forgive yourself, but in time you will. Now watching the robin flit away, Miss Marple thought of that moment, of how guilt and grief so often walked hand in hand, two sides of the same fragile coin. Later that morning, Mrs. Bantry arrived, wrapped in her finest fur coat and carrying a basket of currant scones. "Merry Christmas, Jane. I've brought you breakfast and in the latest gossip, though I dare say you already know it." Miss Marple smiled and gestured toward the fire. "How thoughtful, Dolly, you're a dear. Sit down and tell me, what are the villagers saying today?" "Oh, everything and nothing," Mrs. Bantry said, removing her gloves. "Half of them think the Pettigrews were cursed. The other half think it was divine justice. And of course everyone's suddenly very pious about the church roof fund. Colonel Bantry swears he'll double his donation, mostly to make sure you never start investigating him." Miss Marple laughed quietly. "I think your husband's conscience is quite safe, my dear. Though it's interesting how tragedy makes people generous, as if money could buy them distance from guilt." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "Still, it's sad, isn't it? Lydia Fenton was such a lovely girl. And that poor shopkeeper. Well, one can hardly blame him given his circumstances. It's all so human." Miss Marple nodded. "That's exactly it. So very human. People imagine evil as something dramatic, men in dark coats and daggers in the night. But it's rarely so. Evil, in my experience, is terribly ordinary. It hides in the little things and pride, envy, desperation. It smiles at church, carries parcels to the fete, and gives to charity, until it's found out." For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, and the sound of distant carols drifted through the open window. Then Miss Marple said, "You know, Dolly, I once knew a young man who said Christmas brought out the best in people. He was quite right, but it also brings out the truth. The kind of truth that has been hidden all year, buried beneath manners and mince pies." Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. "You make it sound quite dreadful, Jane." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes glinting. "Oh, not dreadful at all, just necessary." As afternoon turned to twilight, the snow began to fall again, gently, steadily, until the world outside looked like a page from a storybook. The candles were lit in the windows of St. Mildred's, their light glowing golden against the gathering blue. The choir's voices rose once more, singing Silent Night. Miss Marple watched from her armchair, her face serene. Another mystery had been solved, another small corner of darkness dispelled. Yet, as always, there was no triumph in her, only understanding and a kind of quiet sorrow. She set aside her knitting, poured the last of her tea, and whispered as if to the fire itself, "Poor souls, each of them prisoners of their own hearts. The world forgives, but conscience seldom does." Then with a small sigh, she reached for her book, a worn volume of Cranford, and began to read, her voice mingling softly with the carols outside. Through the frost and the candlelight, St. Mary Mead had found its peace again, fragile, temporary, but peace all the same. And somewhere beyond the snow, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the next story waiting to be told. For as long as there were people, there would be secrets. And where there were secrets, Miss Marple would always listen.